The mahogany conference room smelled of leather and old money, the kind of place where fortunes were made and unmade with the stroke of a pen. I sat at the head of the polished table, my hands steady as granite despite everything I'd endured over the past 6 months. The lawyers shuffled their papers nervously, stealing glances at the woman across from me who had once called me Mama, with such genuine love that it could melt even the coldest winter morning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca sat rigid in her designer chair, her manicured fingers drumming impatiently against her Hermès bag. She wore the expression of someone who believed she was about to inherit the world, her lips curved in that self-satisfied smile I had foolishly mistaken for confidence rather than calculating greed. Behind her sat her husband, that slimy investment banker who had whispered poison into her ear for years, and her lawyer, a sharp-suited man whose reputation for ruthlessness preceded him like a storm cloud. The lead attorney cleared his throat and began reading from the document that would change everything. As the words filled the air, I watched my daughter's face transform from smug anticipation to confusion, then to horror, and finally, to a rage, so pure it could have powered the entire city. The color drained from her cheeks when she realized that the mother she had abandoned at Sunset Manor Alzheimer's care facility, the woman she had dismissed as a confused old fool, had been playing a game of chess while she was barely managing checkers. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The papers spoke for themselves, each page a testament to the months of careful planning I had undertaken while she believed I was deteriorating into helpless dementia. $300 million, built over a lifetime of sacrifice and shrewd business decisions, would not be flowing into the hands of someone who had treated love like a commodity to be discarded when inconvenient. My name is Mary Ellen Davis, and for 73 years, I believed that family meant everything. I built my life around that principle, constructing an empire not just of wealth, but of values, traditions, and unwavering loyalty to those who shared my blood. The Davis name had meant something in this city for over half a century, carved into hospital wings, university buildings, and charity foundations that had touched thousands of lives. I had worked tirelessly to ensure that legacy would continue. Through my only child, Rebecca, the daughter I had raised to understand that privilege came with responsibility, and love required reciprocity. The penthouse overlooking Central Park had been our sanctuary for 30 years, a place where Rebecca had grown from a precocious little girl with pigtails into what I believed was a remarkable young woman. The walls were lined with photographs, chronicling our journey together, her first day of school, piano recitals where she played with the passion of someone who truly loved music, family vacations to our lake house in the Adirondacks, where we would spend hours talking about her dreams and aspirations. I had been both mother and father to her after my husband passed when she was only 12, pouring every ounce of my energy into ensuring she would never feel the absence of that second parent. Those early years after the loss were the hardest of my life, but they were also when Rebecca and I became closest. She would climb into my bed during thunderstorms, not because she was afraid of the lightning, but because she sensed I needed the comfort as much as she did. We developed our own language of inside jokes and traditions that no one else could understand. Sunday morning pancakes shaped like her initials, late-night ice cream runs when she had boy trouble, impromptu dance parties in the kitchen when her favorite song came on the radio. I treasured every moment, believing I was raising not just a daughter, but a best friend who would stand by my side through anything life could throw at us. Rebecca had always been brilliant, graduating summa cum laude from Harvard Business School, and immediately making her mark in the corporate world. I was so proud watching her navigate boardrooms with the same confidence I had cultivated over decades of fighting to be taken seriously as a woman in business. She had inherited my drive, my strategic thinking, and what I thought was my moral compass. When she brought David home for the first time, a handsome investment banker with an impressive pedigree and charm that could disarm a hostile takeover, I welcomed him into our family with open arms. I wanted nothing more than to see my daughter happy, settled, living the kind of life that would honor everything we had built together. The wedding was everything Rebecca had dreamed of since she was a little girl playing dress-up in my closet. We spared no expense, transforming the ballroom at the plaza into a fairy tale setting with thousands of white roses and enough crystal chandeliers to light up half of Manhattan. I walked her down the aisle, fighting back tears as I placed her hand in David's, believing I was passing the torch to a man who would cherish her the way she deserved. The reception lasted until dawn, filled with laughter, dancing, and speeches about love conquering all. I gave a toast that night, welcoming David into our family and expressing my joy that Rebecca would never have to face life's challenges alone. For the first few years of their marriage, everything seemed perfect from the outside. They lived in a stunning brownstone just blocks from my penthouse, close enough that Rebecca could stop by for impromptu lunches or weekend dinners. She would call me every morning on her way to work, a tradition we had maintained since her college days, sharing the small details of her life that made me feel connected to her world. We still took our annual mother-daughter trips, exploring European cities and Caribbean islands, creating new memories while reminiscing about old ones. David seemed genuinely fond of me, always remembering my birthday with thoughtful gifts and including me in their holiday plans. But looking back now, I can see the subtle shifts that began happening around their third year of marriage. The daily phone calls became weekly, then sporadic. Rebecca seemed distracted during our conversations, her responses shorter and less engaged. She began declining dinner invitations, citing work commitments or social obligations with David's friends. The trips became less frequent, and when we did travel together, she spent most of her time on her phone, dealing with what she claimed were urgent business matters that couldn't wait. I told myself it was natural, the evolution of a daughter, growing into her own life as a married woman. I remembered how consuming new love could be, how it could make everything else seem secondary for a while. I gave her space, respected her boundaries, and continued to be available whenever she needed me. When she called with exciting news about a promotion or complained about difficult clients, I listened with the same enthusiasm and support I had always provided. I never wanted to be the clingy mother who couldn't let go, so I adapted to this new normal, while hoping that eventually the pendulum would swing back toward the closeness we had once shared. The business that had made our fortune was something I had built from nothing, starting with a small import company that specialized in unique textiles from South America. Over 4 decades, I had grown it into a multinational corporation with interests in everything from sustainable fashion to renewable energy. Every decision I made was calculated not just for immediate profit, but for long-term stability and growth. I had always planned for Rebecca to take over eventually, grooming her for leadership from the time she was old enough to understand what Daddy's company meant to our family's legacy. During her childhood, she would spend summers at the office, starting with simple tasks like filing and gradually working her way up to shadowing me during important meetings. She had a natural aptitude for understanding market trends and consumer behavior, often offering insights that impressed even my most seasoned executives. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By the time she finished business school, she was ready to take on significant responsibilities within the company, and I was thrilled to finally have her working alongside me in an official capacity. Rebecca thrived in the corporate environment, quickly proving herself capable of handling complex negotiations and strategic planning. She had a gift for reading people, understanding their motivations and weaknesses in ways that served her well in business dealings. I watched with pride as she closed deals that had seemed impossible, charmed investors who had initially been skeptical, and implemented innovative strategies that increased our profit margins year after year. She was everything I had hoped she would become, a worthy successor who would carry our family's values into the next generation. The company became another bond between us, a shared passion that gave us hours of conversation material and common goals to work toward together. We would often stay late at the office, discussing expansion opportunities or potential partnerships over takeout dinners in my executive suite. Those were some of my happiest moments, watching my daughter's mind work through complex problems. With the same analytical approach I had taught her, seeing glimpses of the little girl who used to ask endless questions about everything from accounting principles to international trade regulations. When Rebecca announced she was ready to start a family, I was overjoyed at the prospect of becoming a grandmother. I imagined teaching my grandchildren the same values I had instilled in their mother, sharing family stories and traditions that would connect them to their heritage. I began dreaming of holiday gatherings filled with multiple generations, of watching Rebecca experience the profound joy of motherhood that had been the greatest blessing of my own life. I even started converting one of the spare bedrooms in the penthouse into a nursery, complete with hand-painted murals and a rocking chair that had been passed down through 3 generations of Davis women. But months passed, then years, and the grandchildren I had anticipated never arrived. When I gently asked about their family planning, Rebecca would brush off my questions with vague responses about timing and career priorities. David would change the subject entirely, steering conversations towards safer topics like vacation destinations or restaurant recommendations. I sensed there was more to the story, but I respected their privacy and tried not to press for details. They weren't ready to share. I told myself that modern couples faced different pressures than my generation had, that they were probably waiting for the perfect moment to expand their family. Looking back, I wonder if that was when the first cracks began to appear in our relationship, though I was too trusting to recognize them at the time. Rebecca seemed increasingly stressed about work, taking on more responsibilities while complaining about the pressure and long hours. She began making comments about the burden of family expectations, how exhausting it was to constantly live up to the Davis name and everything it represented. I tried to reassure her that she was doing wonderfully, that I had never expected perfection, only that she be true to herself and the values we shared. But something fundamental was shifting in my daughter, something I couldn't quite identify but that made our interactions feel different, more formal and less intimate. She began speaking about the company in terms of financial metrics rather than the mission and purpose that had always driven our decisions. She questioned charitable commitments that had been important to me for decades, suggesting that perhaps it was time to optimize our giving strategy in ways that would provide better tax advantages. She seemed to view our wealth not as a responsibility to be stewarded carefully, but as a resource to be maximized and enjoyed without the constraints of obligation to others. I attributed these changes to the influence of David's social circle, young professionals who measured success purely in monetary terms and seemed to view philanthropy as something for older, established families rather than ambitious couples still building their own wealth. I hoped that as Rebecca matured and settled into her role within the company, she would rediscover the sense of purpose that had always motivated our family's approach to business and life. I believed that love and patience would eventually bring her back to the values I had worked so hard to instill, that the daughter I had raised with such care and devotion was still there underneath the surface changes. The penthouse that had once been filled with Rebecca's laughter and our easy conversations began to feel larger and quieter as her visits became less frequent. I would find myself preparing dinner for 2 out of habit, then remembering that she wouldn't be joining me for our traditional Sunday meals. The photographs that lined the hallways seemed to mock me with their images of happier times, when my daughter's smile was genuine and her affection felt unconditional. I started spending more time at the office, burying myself in work to avoid confronting the growing distance between us. But even as I sensed our relationship changing, I never could have imagined how far Rebecca was willing to go to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. I never suspected that the daughter I had loved unconditionally, protected fiercely, and trusted completely was capable of the betrayal that would ultimately reveal her true character. I continued to believe in the bond we had shared, the foundation of love and mutual respect that I thought was unshakable. I was about to learn that some people are willing to destroy even the most sacred relationships when enough money is at stake. The first real warning sign came during what should have been a routine family dinner on a rainy Thursday evening in October. Rebecca had actually accepted my invitation, something that had become increasingly rare, and I had spent the entire afternoon preparing her favorite meal of herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables. I set the dining room table with our finest china, lit candles, and opened a bottle of wine I had been saving for a special occasion. I was so grateful for the opportunity to spend quality time together that I overlooked the calculating look in her eyes when she walked through the door. The conversation started normally enough, with updates about work and mutual acquaintances, but gradually shifted toward topics that made me uncomfortable. Rebecca began asking detailed questions about my estate planning, inquiring about the specifics of my will and trust arrangements with a persistence that felt more like an interrogation than casual curiosity. She wanted to know about liquid assets, investment portfolios, and the current valuation of the company, information that seemed inappropriate for a family dinner conversation. When I deflected her questions with gentle humor, suggesting that such serious topics could wait for a more appropriate time, Rebecca's demeanor changed noticeably. She became agitated, accusing me of being secretive and controlling, of treating her like a child rather than a trusted business partner and heir. The accusations stung because they were so far from how I viewed our relationship, but I tried to remain calm and reassuring, explaining that I simply preferred to keep business and family time separate when possible. But Rebecca wasn't satisfied with my explanations. She pressed harder, demanding to know why I was being so evasive about financial matters that would eventually become her responsibility anyway. Her voice took on an edge I had never heard before, sharp and demanding in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of David's tone during business negotiations. She seemed to view my reluctance to discuss estate details as a personal affront, evidence that I didn't trust her judgment or respect her position as my successor. The evening ended badly, with Rebecca storming out after accusing me of playing power games and manipulating her through financial withholding. I sat alone at the dining room table, staring at the untouched salmon and wondering what had happened to the daughter who had once confided her deepest thoughts and dreams to me. With complete openness, the candles burned down to nothing as I tried to process the conversation, searching for clues about where our relationship had gone so wrong. That night marked the beginning of what would become a pattern of increasingly tense interactions, conversations that felt more like business negotiations than family discussions. Rebecca's calls became infrequent and transactional, focused primarily on company matters or financial questions that I began to realize were part of a larger strategy I didn't yet understand. The warmth and spontaneity that had characterized our relationship for decades disappeared, replaced by a cool formality that broke my heart every time I heard it in her voice. I tried repeatedly to bridge the growing chasm between us, inviting her to lunch, suggesting weekend trips, even offering to take a step back from the company to give her more autonomy and responsibility. But nothing I did seemed to restore the closeness we had once shared. If anything, my efforts to reconnect appeared to irritate her further, as if my desire for our old relationship was an inconvenience she no longer had time to accommodate. Looking back, I can see that Rebecca had already begun implementing her plan during those months of growing distance. She was gathering information, building relationships with key people in my financial and legal circles, and positioning herself for what she believed would be an inevitable transition of power. She had calculated that sentiment and family bonds were obstacles to be overcome rather than treasures to be preserved, and she was methodically removing anything that might interfere with her ultimate objective. But I was still the woman who had built a business empire from nothing, who had navigated hostile takeovers and economic downturns with strategic brilliance that had earned the respect of competitors and colleagues alike. The same instincts that had made me successful in business were beginning to detect inconsistencies in Rebecca's behavior. subtle signs that suggested her motivations were more complex than simple impatience with my leadership style. I wasn't ready to acknowledge the full scope of what she was planning, but somewhere deep in my subconscious, warning bells were starting to ring. The company that had been our shared passion became another battleground, with Rebecca increasingly challenging my decisions and questioning strategies that had proven successful for decades. She began holding separate meetings with key executives, supposedly to discuss operational efficiencies, but really to build alliances that would support her eventual takeover. She started making unilateral decisions about smaller projects, testing the boundaries of her authority while claiming that rapid response was necessary in today's fast-moving business environment. I found myself walking on eggshells in my own company, careful not to appear too controlling or resistant to change, while simultaneously trying to maintain the standards and principles that had made us successful. Rebecca seemed to interpret every boundary I set as evidence of my inability to adapt to modern business practices. Every question I asked as proof that I was losing my edge and becoming a liability rather than an asset. The stress of managing our deteriorating relationship while running a complex business began taking a toll on my health and energy. I wasn't sleeping well, my appetite decreased, and I found myself making small mistakes that would have been unthinkable in earlier years. Friends and colleagues began commenting on how tired I looked, suggesting that perhaps it was time to consider reducing my workload or taking a vacation to recharge my batteries. But I couldn't shake the feeling that stepping back, even temporarily, would be interpreted as weakness or incapacity by Rebecca and her growing circle of supporters within the company. I was caught in an impossible situation, needing rest and perspective, while simultaneously feeling the need to prove that I was still sharp, still capable of leading the organization I had spent my life building. The irony wasn't lost on me that the daughter I had groomed to be my successor had become the source of my greatest professional stress. As autumn turned to winter, our family dinners became a thing of the past, replaced by formal business meetings in conference rooms where Rebecca's lawyer had started making appearances. She claimed that David thought it would be prudent to have legal counsel present during discussions of succession planning, a suggestion that felt like another step away from the trust and intimacy that had once defined our relationship. I agreed to the arrangement because I hoped that establishing clear expectations and timelines might restore some stability to our interactions. But even those structured meetings felt more like hostile negotiations than family planning sessions. Rebecca's demands became increasingly aggressive, with requests for immediate control over certain business units and complaints about the pace of transition planning. She seemed to view my reluctance to hand over complete authority as evidence of my selfishness and inability to recognize her competence, rather than the natural caution of someone who had spent decades building something precious and valuable. The holidays that year were particularly painful, with Rebecca declining most invitations and making token appearances at events that had once brought our family together in celebration and gratitude. She seemed distant and distracted even when physically present, more interested in her phone than in conversations with relatives who had watched her grow up and genuinely cared about her well-being. I found myself making excuses for her behavior to concerned family members, protecting her reputation even as she seemed determined to distance herself from the connections that had once mattered to both of us. New Year's Eve came and went without the traditional mother-daughter celebration we had shared for over 30 years. Another tradition sacrificed to whatever force was driving Rebecca away from our family bonds. I spent the evening alone in the penthouse, looking out at the city lights and wondering how I had failed so completely as a mother that my only child could treat our relationship as something disposable and inconvenient. But I was still Mary, Ellen Davis, and I hadn't built an empire by accepting defeat when faced with challenges that seemed insurmountable. If Rebecca was determined to treat our relationship as a business transaction, then perhaps it was time for me to approach the situation with the same strategic thinking I had used to overcome every other obstacle in my professional life. I began to pay closer attention to the details of her behavior, documenting conversations and keeping records of decisions that seemed inconsistent with the values she claimed to uphold. What I discovered in the months that followed would test every assumption I had ever made about the daughter I thought I knew, and force me to make decisions that would determine not just the fate of my fortune, but the legacy of everything I had worked to build and protect. The beginning of the end started with a phone call on a cold February morning that would change everything forever. The phone call came at 7:30 in the morning, just as I was settling into my office with my first cup of coffee and the daily financial reports. Rebecca's voice carried an unusual urgency that immediately put me on alert, though I couldn't have imagined the depths of deception that lay behind her carefully chosen words. "Mother, I'm worried about you," she began, her tone a perfect blend of concern and authority that I would later recognize as masterfully rehearsed. "David and I have been discussing some things we've noticed lately, and we think it might be time for you to consider having a comprehensive health evaluation." I set down my coffee cup, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the February weather outside my office windows. "What kind of things, Rebecca? I feel perfectly fine." "Well, that's just it," she continued, her voice taking on the patient tone one might use with a confused child. "Sometimes people don't notice changes in themselves. You've been forgetting things during our business meetings, making decisions that don't seem entirely logical. Last week you couldn't remember the name of that client we've worked with for 15 years. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire I couldn't yet see. I searched my memory for the incident she referenced, finding nothing but clear recollections of every meeting, every decision, every conversation we'd had in recent months. "Rebecca, I think you might be mistaken. I remember that meeting perfectly, and I certainly haven't forgotten Harold Peterson's name." "See, that's exactly what I'm talking about," she said, and I could almost hear her exchanging glances with David in the background. "You're getting defensive instead of acknowledging that there might be a problem. Dr. Harrison at Mount Sinai has agreed to see you this afternoon for a preliminary assessment. It's nothing invasive, just some simple tests to establish a baseline. Dr. Harrison?" I knew the name from charity events and hospital board meetings. A respected neurologist whose specialty was aging-related cognitive disorders. The fact that Rebecca had already contacted him, had already scheduled an appointment without consulting me, sent warning signals through my brain that I tried desperately to ignore. This was my daughter, the child I had raised with infinite love and patience. Surely she was acting out of genuine concern rather than some ulterior motive I couldn't yet comprehend. "I appreciate your concern, darling, but I really don't think that's necessary," I said, trying to keep my voice level and reasonable. "I've been under some stress lately with the quarterly reports and the merger discussions, but that's hardly unusual for this time of year." "Mother, please." Rebecca's voice cracked slightly, a note of what sounded like genuine desperation creeping in. "I'm scared. I love you so much, and I can't bear the thought of losing you gradually, piece by piece. If there's something wrong, wouldn't you rather know sooner rather than later? Wouldn't you want to have time to make arrangements, to ensure everything is handled properly?" The manipulation was so subtle, so wrapped in the language of love and family concern, that for a moment I almost believed she was simply a worried daughter trying to protect her aging mother. But something in her phrasing, particularly that mention of making arrangements, struck me as oddly calculated. I found myself wondering what kind of arrangements she might have in mind, and whether they had more to do with my business affairs than my health. "All right," I heard myself saying, though every instinct I had developed over 7 decades of navigating complex situations was screaming warnings. "I'll go to the appointment, but I want you to understand that I'm doing this to ease your concerns, not because I believe there's anything wrong with me." "Of course, Mother. That's all I want. David and I will pick you up at 2 o'clock. Dr. Harrison's office is at the medical center, and we can grab an early dinner afterward if you're feeling up to it." The appointment was scheduled with suspicious efficiency, as if Rebecca had been planning this conversation for weeks, rather than reacting to sudden concerns about my well-being. After she hung up, I sat in my office trying to make sense of the morning's developments. Rebecca's examples of my supposed confusion seemed fabricated. Her concerns felt rehearsed, and the speed with which she had arranged medical consultation suggested a level of preparation that didn't match her claimed spontaneous worry. I called my personal physician, Dr. Margaret Chen, who had been monitoring my health for over 20 years. When I explained Rebecca's concerns and the appointment she had arranged, Dr. Chen's response was immediate and unequivocal. "Mary Ellen, I gave you a complete physical just 3 months ago, including cognitive function tests. Your results were excellent across the board. Your memory, reasoning, and analytical skills tested in the superior range for someone of any age, let alone 73. If you're experiencing the kind of cognitive decline your daughter is describing, it would have to be extremely rapid and dramatic, which would be highly unusual for any form of dementia." Dr. Chen's words provided some reassurance, but they also deepened my growing suspicion that Rebecca's motivations weren't entirely pure. Why would a daughter who saw me regularly in business settings suddenly notice cognitive problems that my longtime physician had found no evidence of during extensive testing? The ride to Mount Sinai was uncomfortable in ways that went far beyond the winter traffic. Rebecca sat beside me in the back of David's Mercedes, her hand resting on mine in a gesture that felt more possessive than comforting. She spent most of the journey pointing out things I supposedly wouldn't remember, incidents from recent weeks that she claimed demonstrated my declining mental state. "Remember last Tuesday when you couldn't find your keys?" she said, her voice filled with exaggerated patience. "You spent 20 minutes looking for them before I reminded you they were in your purse." I did remember that day, but my recollection was quite different. I had been searching for my reading glasses, not my keys, and I had found them myself after checking several places where I commonly left them. The distortion of the memory was so subtle that someone who hadn't been present might easily accept Rebecca's version, but it revealed a level of calculated deception that made my stomach turn. David contributed his own observations, describing conversations where I had allegedly repeated myself or failed to follow the thread of complex discussions. Each example felt like a small knife thrust, not because they were accurate, but because they revealed how carefully my daughter and son-in-law had been cataloging perceived weaknesses, building a case against my competency with the methodical precision of prosecutors preparing for trial. Dr. Harrison's office was everything one would expect from a highly regarded specialist, tastefully decorated, filled with diplomas and awards, designed to inspire confidence in his expertise. The man himself was younger than I had expected, perhaps 55, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of serious demeanor that suggested he took his responsibilities gravely. Rebecca insisted on accompanying me into the consultation room, positioning herself slightly behind my chair where she could observe both my responses and the doctor's reactions. Her presence felt intrusive and manipulative, but I allowed it because I still believed, or wanted to believe, that her motivations were rooted in genuine concern rather than calculated strategy. The initial questions were routine. General health, history, family medical background, current medications and supplements. Dr. Harrison's manner was professional but somewhat distant, as if he had already formed preliminary conclusions before meeting me. When he began asking about recent memory issues and cognitive concerns, his phrasing suggested that Rebecca had provided him with substantial background information that painted a picture of declining mental function. "Your daughter mentioned that you've been having difficulty with names and faces of long-term business associates," Dr. Harrison said, consulting notes that could only have come from Rebecca's prior communication. "Can you tell me about any instances where you've struggled to recall information that was previously automatic?" I answered honestly, explaining that while I occasionally had the normal delays in recall that affect everyone as they age, I hadn't experienced any significant memory problems or cognitive difficulties. I described my daily routine, my continued involvement in complex business decisions, and my ability to maintain the demanding schedule that running a large corporation required. But as I spoke, I could see Dr. Harrison glancing at Rebecca, whose subtle facial expressions seemed to contradict everything I was saying. She would shake her head slightly when she thought the doctor was looking, raise her eyebrows in skeptical disbelief, or make small gestures that suggested my self-assessment was unreliable and possibly delusional. The formal testing began with simple exercises, remembering lists of words, drawing clock faces, solving basic mathematical problems. I completed each task easily, my performance consistent with the cognitive testing I had undergone with Dr. Chen just months earlier. But Dr. Harrison's interpretation of my results seemed influenced by whatever preconceptions Rebecca had planted during their preliminary conversations. Mrs. Davis, while your performance on these basic tests appears adequate, it's important to understand that early-stage cognitive impairment can be quite subtle, Dr. Harrison explained, his tone suggesting that normal test results were somehow evidence of a problem rather than proof of cognitive health. Many people in the beginning stages of dementia can still perform well on standard assessments while experiencing significant functional decline in real-world situations. Rebecca nodded solemnly, playing the role of the concerned daughter, with Academy Award-worthy conviction. That's exactly what we've been seeing, Doctor. Mother can still handle simple tasks, but complex decision-making and judgment seem to be compromised. She's been making business choices that don't reflect her usual strategic thinking. I wanted to challenge this characterization, to demand specific examples of these allegedly poor decisions, but something in Dr. Harrison's demeanor suggested that defending myself would only be interpreted as further evidence of impaired insight and judgment. I was trapped in a situation where any response I gave could be twisted to support the narrative Rebecca was constructing. The appointment continued with more specialized tests designed to assess executive function, attention, and processing speed. Again, my performance was within normal ranges, but Dr. Harrison's commentary focused on areas of supposed concern that seemed to exist more in Rebecca's descriptions than in any objective evidence. I'd like to recommend a more comprehensive evaluation, Dr. Harrison concluded, pulling out a referral pad. There's a facility called Sunset Manor that specializes in assessment and short-term care for patients with early cognitive impairment. They can provide a controlled environment for observation and more detailed testing over a period of several days. The words hit me like a physical blow. Rebecca had maneuvered me from a routine medical consultation to a recommendation for institutional evaluation in the span of a single afternoon. The speed and efficiency of the process suggested a level of pre-planning that made my head spin with the implications. "Doctor, I really don't think that's necessary," I said, trying to maintain my composure while my mind raced through the potential consequences of agreeing to such an arrangement. "I'm perfectly capable of living independently and managing my affairs. I'd prefer to continue with my regular physician for any follow-up care." "I understand your reluctance, Mrs. Davis," Dr. Harrison replied, his tone patient but firm. "Resistance to evaluation is actually quite common in patients with early dementia. The brain changes that affect judgment also impact the ability to recognize those changes. That's why family input is so crucial in these situations." Rebecca leaned forward, her face a mask of loving concern. "Mother, please. This isn't about taking away your independence. It's about making sure you get the help you need. Sunset Manor is a beautiful facility, more like a resort than a hospital. You'd only be there for a few days while they run some tests and observe your daily functioning. If everything comes back normal, you'll be home by the weekend, and we'll all have peace of mind." The pressure was mounting from both directions, professional medical opinion and family concern combining to make any resistance seem unreasonable and potentially dangerous. I felt like I was being swept along by a current I couldn't quite identify, but was powerless to fight against. "What kind of facility is this Sunset Manor?" I asked, trying to gather information that might help me understand what I was agreeing to. "It's a premier assessment center for cognitive disorders," Dr. Harrison explained, handing me a glossy brochure. They provide comprehensive evaluation services in a comfortable residential setting. Many of their clients are high-functioning individuals who need specialized assessment that can't be provided in traditional outpatient settings. The brochure showed beautiful grounds, tastefully decorated common areas, and smiling staff members attending to well-dressed elderly residents. It looked more like an upscale resort than a medical facility, which I supposed was intended to make the prospect of evaluation seem less threatening and institutional. Rebecca was studying my face carefully, gauging my reaction and preparing. Her next move in what I was beginning to recognize as a carefully orchestrated campaign. "Mother, I know this is scary, but David and I will be involved every step of the way. We'll visit daily, communicate with your care team, and make sure you're comfortable throughout the process." The mention of a care team sent another chill through me. In my experience, people who needed care teams were people who could no longer care for themselves, a category I definitely didn't belong to despite Rebecca's apparent convictions to the contrary. "I need some time to think about this," I said, standing up from my chair and gathering my purse. "I appreciate your concern, Dr. Harrison, but I'm not ready to commit to residential evaluation based on a single consultation." "Of course," he replied smoothly. "But I would encourage you not to delay too long. Early intervention is crucial. In managing cognitive decline, and the longer we wait, the fewer options we may have available." The ride home was even more uncomfortable than the trip to the medical center. Rebecca and David kept up a steady stream of persuasion, presenting the evaluation as an inevitable necessity rather than an optional recommendation. They spoke about me as if I weren't present, discussing arrangements and logistics with the casual efficiency of people planning a vacation rather than contemplating a medical intervention. "I think we should schedule the admission for early next week," David said, consulting his phone calendar. "That will give us time to get her affairs in order and make sure everything at the company is covered during her absence." Affairs in order seemed like an ominous phrase, suggesting that they viewed this evaluation as more than a temporary inconvenience. I began to wonder what kind of arrangements they had in mind, and whether those arrangements would be easily reversible if the evaluation results didn't support their concerns about my cognitive health. "I haven't agreed to anything yet," I reminded them, my voice sharper than I intended. "I'm perfectly capable of making my own medical decisions, and I'm not convinced that this evaluation is necessary or appropriate." Rebecca turned to face me, her expression a mixture of patience and pity that made my skin crawl. "Mother, that's exactly what Dr. Harrison was talking about. People with early dementia often lack insight into their condition. The fact that you can't see the problems we're all noticing is actually one of the symptoms." The circular logic was maddening. Any objection I raised to their concerns would be interpreted as evidence that those concerns were justified. Any insistence on my competency would be seen as proof of the impaired judgment they were alleging. I was trapped in a Kafkaesque situation where defending myself only strengthened the case against me. That evening, alone in my penthouse, I tried to make sense of what had happened. The day had started with a normal morning routine and ended with a recommendation for institutional evaluation that could potentially change the entire trajectory of my life. The speed and coordination of Rebecca's campaign suggested months of preparation rather than sudden concern about my well-being. I called Dr. Chen to discuss Dr. Harrison's recommendations and get her perspective on the evaluation process he had outlined. Her response was immediate and alarming. "Mary Ellen, based on my recent examination and testing, I see absolutely no medical justification for the kind of intensive evaluation Dr. Harrison is recommending. Your cognitive function is excellent, your judgment appears sound, and you show no signs of the executive dysfunction that would typically prompt such intervention." "Then why would he make such a recommendation?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. Without examining his notes or understanding the specific information he was given, I can't say for certain. But I will tell you that Residential cognitive assessment is sometimes recommended when family members are concerned about competency issues that go beyond pure medical considerations. It's possible that he was responding to information about your decision-making capacity, rather than clinical evidence of cognitive decline. The implications of Dr. Chen's words were chilling. Rebecca wasn't just questioning my health. She was questioning my competency to manage my own affairs. The evaluation she was pushing for might not be designed to assess my cognitive function so much as to establish grounds for declaring me unable to make my own decisions about financial and personal matters. I spent that night going through financial records, legal documents, and business files, trying to understand what might motivate Rebecca to pursue such a drastic course of action. What I discovered made me sick to my stomach and forced me to confront a truth I had been desperately trying to avoid. Over the past 6 months, Rebecca had been systematically positioning herself to take control of my business and personal assets. She had cultivated relationships with key board members, financial advisors, and legal representatives, presenting herself as the responsible family member preparing to handle an aging mother's increasing incapacity. She had requested copies of important documents, claiming she needed them for succession planning, but actually using them to understand the full scope of what she would inherit. Most disturbing of all, I found evidence that Rebecca had been consulting with elder law attorneys about guardianship procedures and competency evaluations. The legal research she had conducted focused specifically on the process for obtaining court-appointed guardianship over elderly family members who were deemed unable to manage their own affairs. The picture that emerged was of a daughter who had decided that waiting for her natural inheritance was taking too long and too uncertain. Rebecca had apparently concluded that engineering my removal from decision-making authority was a more efficient path to controlling the family fortune than hoping I would voluntarily step aside or waiting for natural aging to diminish my capabilities. The phone rang again the next morning, this time with Rebecca calling to follow up on Dr. Harrison's recommendations and discuss scheduling for the Sunset Manor evaluation. Her voice carried the same note of loving concern, but now I could hear the underlying calculation that had been there all along. "I've spoken with the admissions coordinator at Sunset Manor, Mother, and they have an opening next Monday. I really think we should take advantage of the opportunity to get this evaluation done as quickly as possible." "Rebecca, I've decided not to pursue the evaluation at this time," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I've consulted with Dr. Chen, and she doesn't believe it's medically necessary. I'm comfortable with my current level of care and supervision." The silence that followed was telling. When Rebecca finally responded, her tone had shifted from loving concern to barely concealed frustration. "Mother, I'm disappointed that you're not taking this seriously. David and I have been watching you decline for months, and we're not the only ones who've noticed. If you won't get help voluntarily, we may have to explore other options." "What kind of other options?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand exactly what she meant. "Legal options," she said, the words clipped and cold. "If you're not competent to make rational decisions about your own health care, then someone else is going to have to make those decisions for you. I don't want it to come to that, but I won't stand by and watch you deteriorate without intervention." The threat was clear, even wrapped in the language of family concern. Rebecca was prepared to seek legal guardianship if I didn't comply with her demands for evaluation. The process would involve court hearings, medical testimony, and potentially weeks or months of legal proceedings that would expose my personal and financial affairs to public scrutiny. "I see," I said quietly. "And I suppose you've already researched what that process would involve?" "I've consulted with attorneys, yes," Rebecca admitted, no longer bothering to hide the extent of her preparation. "But I'd much rather handle this privately, within the family." The evaluation at Sunset Manor would provide the documentation we need to ensure you get appropriate care and supervision going forward. The conversation ended with Rebecca giving me 24 hours to reconsider her offer of voluntary evaluation. After that, she made it clear she would be forced to pursue legal remedies that would be much more public and potentially embarrassing for everyone involved. I hung up the phone and sat in my office, surrounded by the evidence of a life's work, that my own daughter was now trying to steal from me using the language of love and medical concern. For the first time since this nightmare began, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of Rebecca's betrayal and the devastating reality that the child I had raised with such devotion was willing to destroy me to get what she wanted. But I was still Mary Ellen Davis, and I hadn't built an empire by surrendering to people who underestimated my intelligence and determination. If Rebecca wanted to play games with my competency and my freedom, she was about to discover that her mother had learned a few things about strategy and survival during 7 decades of life and 4 decades of business. The war she had started was about to become much more complicated than she could possibly imagine. The 24 hours Rebecca had given me to consider voluntary evaluation became the most crucial day of planning in my entire 73 years of life. I knew that once I entered Sunset Manor, even for what Rebecca called a simple assessment, I would lose control over the narrative being constructed around my supposed cognitive decline. Every action I took, every word I spoke, every moment of confusion or hesitation would be documented and interpreted through the lens of suspected dementia. I started by calling my longtime attorney, Charles Morrison, a brilliant legal mind who had guided me through decades of complex business negotiations and personal legal matters. Charles had known me since Rebecca was a teenager, had watched her grow up, and had helped draft many of the documents that now formed the foundation of my estate planning. "Charles, I need to see you immediately," I said, dispensing with pleasantries. "I have reason to believe that Rebecca is planning to challenge my competency, and I need to understand my legal options before she makes her next move." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had been dropped. When Charles finally spoke, his voice carried a gravity that confirmed my worst fears. "Mary Ellen, I have to tell you something that may come as a shock. Rebecca contacted my office 3 weeks ago, asking about the process for obtaining emergency guardianship over a family member with diminished capacity. She specifically inquired about the documentation required and the timeline for court proceedings. The betrayal cut deeper than I had imagined possible. Rebecca hadn't just been planning this intervention. She had been researching it for weeks, consulting with my own attorney about the best way to remove me from control of my own life. The fact that Charles had received these inquiries and hadn't immediately informed me suggested that Rebecca had been very careful about how she presented her concerns. "What exactly did she tell you?" I asked, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. "She said she was worried about your recent behavior, that you'd been making erratic business decisions and showing signs of memory problems. She asked whether it would be possible to obtain temporary guardianship if you refused medical evaluation. She was very convincing, Mary Ellen. If I didn't know you as well as I do, I might have been concerned myself." Charles agreed to meet me at his office that afternoon, but not before giving me advice that chilled me to the bone. "Mary Ellen, if Rebecca is serious about pursuing guardianship, you need to be very careful about everything you do and say over the next few days. Any behavior that could be interpreted as irrational or impaired judgment will be used against you in court proceedings. She's building a case, and every interaction you have with her or her representatives is potentially evidence." I spent the morning preparing for what I now understood was a war for my freedom and my fortune. I gathered medical records from Dr. Chen, financial statements that demonstrated my continued competent management of complex business affairs, and correspondence that showed my clear, rational thinking on a wide range of topics. I also began making discreet inquiries about Rebecca's recent activities, reaching out to trusted colleagues and family friends who might have insights into her behavior and motivations. What I discovered was even more damaging than I had anticipated. Rebecca had been conducting a subtle campaign for months, planting seeds of concern about my mental state with key people in our social and professional circles. She had mentioned to my banker that she was worried about my recent investment decisions. She had suggested to board members that I seemed confused during meetings. She had even spoken to my housekeeper about my supposed forgetfulness and disorganization. Each conversation had been carefully crafted to seem like the natural concern of a loving daughter, but together they formed a pattern of character assassination that would provide powerful testimony if Rebecca decided to pursue legal guardianship. She had been methodically destroying my reputation for competency while positioning herself as the responsible family member trying to protect an aging mother from her own declining judgment. The meeting with Charles was both enlightening and terrifying. He explained that guardianship proceedings in New York were designed to protect vulnerable elderly people from exploitation and abuse, but they could also be weaponized by family members seeking to gain control of substantial assets. The burden of proof was relatively low, especially when family members presented what appeared to be credible evidence of cognitive decline, and the alleged incapacitated person's own doctor supported the concerns. The key issue, Charles explained, is that Rebecca has been very smart about building her case. She's not just claiming that you're incompetent, she's documenting a pattern of concerning behavior and seeking professional medical validation for her concerns. Dr. Harrison's recommendation for intensive evaluation gives her a strong foundation for arguing that you need immediate protection from your own impaired judgment. Charles outlined the legal process that Rebecca would likely follow if I continued to resist her demands for voluntary evaluation. She would file a petition with the court alleging that I was incapacitated and unable to make rational decisions about my personal care and financial affairs. The court would appoint an independent attorney to represent my interests, but that attorney would be working with limited information and might be influenced by the same medical opinions that Rebecca had already secured. The most dangerous part, Charles continued, is that once she files the petition, the court can issue temporary orders restricting your ability to make financial decisions or even requiring you to submit to the very evaluation you're trying to avoid. You could find yourself in exactly the position she wants you in, regardless of whether the ultimate court decision goes in your favor. I left Charles's office with a clearer understanding of the legal landscape and a growing appreciation for just how thoroughly Rebecca had planned her assault on my independence. But I also left with something she probably hadn't counted on: a detailed understanding of her strategy and timeline that would allow me to plan my own countermoves. The key insight was that Rebecca's entire plan depended on the assumption that I was either too confused to understand what was happening or too passive to fight back effectively. She had spent months positioning herself as the responsible family member while painting me as an increasingly incapacitated elderly woman who needed protection from her own poor judgment. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated the very intelligence and strategic thinking she was claiming I had lost. That evening, I began implementing a plan that would turn Rebecca's own tactics against her while protecting my assets and my freedom. The first step was ensuring that I had irrefutable documentation of my continued mental competency, evidence that would be impossible for Rebecca to challenge or manipulate. I arranged for comprehensive cognitive and psychological testing with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a forensic neuropsychologist who specialized in competency evaluations for legal proceedings. Dr. Rodriguez was known for her thorough, objective assessments and her willingness to testify in court about her findings. I specifically requested testing that would establish baseline cognitive function and provide detailed documentation of my decision-making capacity, memory function, and judgment abilities. The testing took place over 2 full days and was more exhaustive than anything I had ever experienced. Dr. Rodriguez evaluated everything from basic memory and attention to complex problem-solving and executive function. She interviewed me extensively about my business background, my current responsibilities, and my understanding of my financial and legal affairs. She even administered specialized tests designed to detect malingering or attempts to fake cognitive impairment. The results were unequivocal. Dr. Rodriguez's report stated that I demonstrated superior cognitive function across all domains tested and showed no evidence of any form of cognitive impairment or decline. Her assessment explicitly noted that my performance was entirely inconsistent with any diagnosis of dementia or other cognitive disorder, and that my judgment and decision-making abilities were well above average for individuals of any age. Armed with this professional validation of my competency, I moved to the second phase of my plan, protecting my assets from any attempt by Rebecca to gain control through guardianship proceedings or other legal maneuvers. I met with a different attorney, Elizabeth Harper, who specialized in asset protection and estate planning for high-net-worth individuals facing family disputes. Elizabeth helped me restructure certain aspects of my financial arrangements to ensure that even if Rebecca succeeded in obtaining some form of guardianship, the bulk of my assets would remain beyond her reach. We established an irrevocable trust, with independent trustees who had no connection to Rebecca or her allies. We also created detailed documentation of my wishes regarding asset management and distribution, making it clear that any attempt to alter these arrangements would be contrary to my clearly expressed intentions. The most crucial element of this financial restructuring was ensuring that my estate planning documents were updated to reflect my current understanding of Rebecca's character and motivations. Working with Elizabeth, I drafted new provisions that would automatically trigger if anyone attempted to challenge my competency or gain unauthorized control over my affairs. These provisions included specific consequences for beneficiaries who participated in legal proceedings designed to undermine my autonomy or decision-making authority. While I was securing my legal and financial position, I was also gathering intelligence about Rebecca's activities and plans. I hired a private investigator, a former FBI agent named Marcus Thompson, who specialized in family financial disputes and elder abuse cases. Marcus's job was to document Rebecca's recent behavior, her financial situation, and any evidence of the calculated campaign she had been waging against my reputation. What Marcus discovered was even more damaging than I had imagined. Rebecca and David were facing significant financial pressures that I had been unaware of. David's investment banking career was not as successful as they had portrayed, and they had accumulated substantial debts, financing a lifestyle that exceeded their actual income. They had taken out loans against their expectation of inheriting my estate, borrowing money they could only repay if they gained access to my assets much sooner than natural inheritance would provide. Marcus also uncovered evidence of Rebecca's systematic campaign to undermine my reputation. He obtained recordings of conversations where Rebecca had suggested to business associates that I was becoming unreliable and that they should direct important communications through her instead of dealing with me directly. He documented her attempts to gain access to my financial accounts by claiming that I had authorized her to handle certain transactions due to my supposed confusion and memory problems. Most importantly, Marcus discovered that Rebecca had already begun making arrangements for my commitment to Sunset Manor, including discussions about long-term care options and the potential need for permanent residential placement if the evaluation revealed the cognitive decline she was claiming to observe. She had essentially decided that I would be declared incompetent before any evaluation had even taken place. With comprehensive documentation of my mental competency, legal protection for my assets, and evidence of Rebecca's calculated deception, I was ready to implement the final phase of my plan. But first, I needed to understand exactly what Rebecca was planning for our confrontation at Sunset Manor, and I needed to ensure that her scheme would backfire in the most decisive way possible. I called Rebecca and agreed to the evaluation she had been demanding, but with conditions that she would find difficult to refuse without revealing her true motivations. Rebecca, I've thought carefully about your concerns, and I've decided that you're right about the need for a comprehensive evaluation, I said, modulating my voice to sound tired and somewhat defeated. But I want to make sure that this process is handled properly, with full documentation and appropriate legal oversight. The surprise in Rebecca's voice was evident, but she quickly recovered and adopted the tone of loving relief that had become her signature manipulation. "Oh, Mother, I'm so glad you've come to this decision. I know how difficult it must be, but it's really for the best. David and I will handle all the arrangements, and we'll make sure you're comfortable throughout the process. Actually, I'd prefer to handle some of the arrangements myself," I said, beginning to set the trap that would ultimately ensnare her. "I want my own attorney present during any discussions about my care or treatment options. I also want independent medical observers to ensure that the evaluation is conducted objectively and that the results can't be questioned later." Rebecca hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of outside oversight of a process she had hoped to control completely. "Mother, I don't think that's necessary. Dr. Harrison has assured us that Sunset Manor provides completely objective evaluation services. Having too many people involved might actually interfere with the assessment process. Rebecca, if this evaluation is truly about my health and well-being, then you shouldn't have any objection to independent oversight," I said, my voice taking on a slight edge that she would hopefully interpret as confusion rather than suspicion. "I want to make sure that whatever decisions are made have proper legal documentation and can't be challenged later by anyone who might question the process." The mention of potential challenges seemed to alarm Rebecca, probably because she knew that other family members and business associates might indeed question any sudden declarations of my incompetency. She agreed to my conditions, but I could hear the reluctance in her voice and the whispered consultation with David that she thought she was hiding. The date was set for the following Monday, giving me time to complete my preparations and ensure that every element of my counter-strategy was in place. Charles Morrison would accompany me to Sunset Manor as my legal representative. Dr. Rodriguez would be available to provide independent consultation about any medical recommendations, and Marcus Thompson would be documenting Rebecca's behavior. Throughout the process, I spent the weekend creating detailed records of my daily activities, my business decisions, and my interactions with various people, establishing a clear pattern of normal, competent behavior right up until the moment I entered the evaluation facility. I also prepared a series of tests and challenges that would allow me to demonstrate my continued sharp thinking and memory, evidence that would be impossible for Rebecca to explain away if she was claiming I had been experiencing significant cognitive decline. Most importantly, I finalized the legal documents that would be triggered if Rebecca succeeded in her immediate goals, but failed to anticipate the longer-term consequences of her actions. These documents included detailed instructions for challenging any guardianship proceedings, specific provisions for asset protection, and a complete revision of my estate planning that would ensure Rebecca would inherit nothing if she succeeded in having me declared incompetent. The irony was perfect. Rebecca's attempt to gain immediate control over my assets would result in her losing any claim to those assets permanently. She was so focused on the short-term goal of removing me from decision-making authority that she hadn't considered what would happen to her inheritance if she succeeded in proving that I was an unfit mother who had raised a daughter willing to betray her own parent for money. Sunday evening, I sat in my penthouse looking out at the city lights and reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. Just weeks earlier, I had been a successful businesswoman enjoying what I thought was a loving relationship with my accomplished daughter. Now I was preparing for a battle that would determine not just my freedom and my fortune, but the final truth about the child I had raised with such hope and devotion. The woman who would walk into Sunset Manor the next morning would appear to be a confused elderly lady accompanied by concerned family members seeking help for her declining condition. But in reality, she would be a strategic mastermind with extensive legal protection, irrefutable evidence of her continued competency, and a comprehensive plan for exposing the daughter who had tried to destroy her. Rebecca had spent months preparing her case against me, but she had made one fatal error. She had forgotten that I was the woman who had built a business empire from nothing, who had navigated hostile corporate takeovers, and who had spent decades outmaneuvering people who tried to take advantage of her perceived vulnerabilities. The evaluation she was demanding would indeed take place, but the results would be nothing like what she expected. By the time I walked out of Sunset Manor, Rebecca would discover that her careful plans had been turned against her, and that the mother she thought she could manipulate had been planning her own moves long before Rebecca ever made hers. Monday. Morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of weather that seemed appropriate for what I knew would be one of the most important days of my life. I dressed carefully in clothes that projected both dignity and slight vulnerability, the image of an elderly woman who was still trying to maintain her independence despite increasing challenges. Rebecca and David arrived precisely on time, their faces masks of loving concern that I now recognized as calculated performances. The drive to Sunset Manor was filled with the same kind of reassuring conversation Rebecca had been providing for weeks, promises that this evaluation was just a precaution and that I would be home soon with a clean bill of health. But I could see David checking his phone repeatedly, and I noticed Rebecca's hands trembling slightly as she tried to maintain her composure. They were nervous about something, probably worried that their carefully constructed plan might not unfold as smoothly as they had anticipated. Sunset Manor was exactly as advertised, a beautiful facility that looked more like an upscale resort than a medical institution. The grounds were landscaped with gardens and walking paths. The buildings were designed with tasteful architecture that avoided any institutional appearance, and the staff members we encountered projected warmth and professionalism. Under other circumstances, I might have been impressed by the obvious quality of care and attention to detail, but I knew that beneath the attractive surface, this was a place where elderly people's freedom and autonomy could be permanently stripped away based on evaluations that might be influenced by family members with financial motivations rather than genuine concern for well-being. I was walking into a situation where every word I spoke, every action I took, and every moment of confusion or hesitation would be interpreted as evidence supporting Rebecca's claims about my declining competency. The intake process began immediately, with Rebecca and David providing detailed information about my supposed symptoms and concerning behaviors to a team of medical and social work professionals. I listened as my own daughter described a version of me that I barely recognized, a confused and declining elderly woman who was making increasingly poor decisions and becoming a danger to herself and others. According to Rebecca's account, I had been forgetting important appointments, making irrational business decisions, and showing signs of paranoia and suspicion toward family members who were only trying to help. She provided specific examples that were either completely fabricated or grossly distorted versions of normal interactions, each one designed to paint a picture of progressive cognitive decline that would justify the residential evaluation she was requesting. Charles Morrison's presence clearly made the Sunset Manor staff uncomfortable, as they were accustomed to dealing with family members who had complete control over the admission process. But I had insisted on legal representation, and they couldn't prevent him from observing the proceedings and asking questions about the evaluation protocols and documentation procedures. "Mrs. Davis, we understand that you have some concerns about being here," said Dr. Patricia Williams, the facility's medical director. "That's completely normal and understandable. Our goal is simply to conduct a thorough assessment of your current functioning and provide recommendations for any care or support you might benefit from." I responded carefully, projecting appropriate concern about the evaluation while demonstrating the clear thinking and articulate communication that would contradict Rebecca's claims about my cognitive state. "Dr. Williams, I appreciate your professionalism, and I understand that my daughter is worried about me. I'm willing to participate in your evaluation process, but I want to make sure that it's conducted objectively and that the results are properly documented. I've brought my attorney because I want to ensure that my rights are protected throughout this process." The mention of rights seemed to surprise Dr. Williams, who probably expected a confused elderly woman rather than someone who understood the legal implications of competency evaluations. But she recovered quickly and assured me that the facility operated under strict ethical guidelines and that all evaluations were conducted with appropriate respect for patient autonomy and dignity. The first day of evaluation included comprehensive medical examinations, cognitive testing, and interviews with both me and my family members. I performed well on all the formal assessments, demonstrating memory, reasoning, and problem-solving, abilities that were clearly inconsistent with any form of dementia or cognitive impairment. But I could see that the staff was being influenced by Rebecca's dramatic descriptions of my supposed decline, and her insistence that I was skilled at hiding my deficits during formal testing. The real challenge came during the family meeting, where Rebecca and David were invited to provide additional information about their concerns and observations. This was their opportunity to present the case they had been building against my competency, and they took full advantage of the platform. Rebecca's performance was masterful, combining genuine emotion with calculated manipulation in ways that would have been convincing to anyone who hadn't spent months uncovering her deception. She spoke tearfully about watching her mother decline, about the difficulty of accepting that someone she loved and respected was losing the abilities that had once made her so successful and independent. "It's been heartbreaking to watch," Rebecca said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Mother has always been so sharp, so capable of handling complex business matters. But over the past year, we've seen increasing confusion, poor judgment, and what seems like paranoid thinking about people who are only trying to help her." David supported Rebecca's narrative with his own observations, describing business meetings where I had allegedly seemed confused or made decisions that didn't reflect my usual strategic thinking. He spoke about his concern for my safety, noting incidents where I had supposedly forgotten important security procedures or failed to recognize people I had known for years. The staff listened attentively to these accounts, taking detailed notes, and asking follow-up questions that suggested they were finding Rebecca's concerns credible and compelling. Even Charles Morrison seemed somewhat shaken by the detailed and emotional presentation, though he continued to take careful notes about discrepancies between the family's claims and the objective evidence of my performance during formal testing. But Rebecca and David had made one crucial mistake. They had become so committed to their narrative of my decline that they couldn't adjust their story when confronted with evidence that contradicted their claims. When Dr. Williams mentioned that my cognitive testing results were excellent, Rebecca insisted that I was particularly skilled at showboating during formal assessments, while being much more impaired in real-world situations. When the staff noted that I seemed articulate and well-oriented during interviews, David suggested that I was experiencing what he called sundowning, a phenomenon where cognitive symptoms worsened at certain times of day. The problem was that these explanations required increasingly elaborate theories about why someone with supposed dementia could perform normally on comprehensive testing while exhibiting severe impairment in daily life. By the end of the first day, I could see that the evaluation staff was beginning to question the consistency between Rebecca's dramatic descriptions and their own observations of my behavior and capabilities. But I knew that Rebecca had invested too much in this process to give up easily, and that the real confrontation was still to come. That evening, as I settled into the comfortable but institutional room that would be my temporary home, I reflected on the day's events and prepared for the challenges that lay ahead. Rebecca thought she was systematically building a case for my incompetency, but she was actually providing me with evidence of her own calculated deception and manipulation. The next few days would determine whether her schemes succeeded in destroying my freedom, or whether my own careful planning would expose her true motivations and protect everything I had worked so hard to build and preserve. The second morning at Sunset Manor began with what Dr. Williams called a functional assessment, designed to observe how I managed daily activities and routine tasks. Rebecca had specifically requested this type of evaluation, claiming that while I might perform well on formal cognitive tests, I struggled with practical matters like managing medications, handling finances, and making appropriate decisions. About daily care, I approached these assessments with the same strategic mindset I had brought to every important business negotiation in my career. Every action needed to demonstrate competency while allowing Rebecca to continue digging herself deeper into the hole she had created with her increasingly elaborate deceptions. The medication management test was straightforward, organizing pills into weekly dispensers, following complex prescription schedules, and demonstrating understanding of drug interactions and side effects. I completed the task flawlessly, even catching an intentional error the staff had included to test my attention to detail. When the occupational therapist commented on my excellent performance, Rebecca quickly interjected that I had probably been practicing these skills in preparation for the evaluation. "Mother has always been very good at preparing for tests," Rebecca said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of patient concern. "But at home, we found pill bottles scattered around the apartment, doses missed or doubled. She seems to perform better when she knows she's being watched." The explanation sounded plausible enough, but I could see Charles Morrison making notes about the lack of any documentation to support Rebecca's claims. If I had truly been mismanaging medications to the degree she described, there would be evidence in my medical records, pharmacy logs, or at minimum some communication with my physicians about the problems. The financial management assessment was more complex, involving review of bank statements, investment portfolios, and business documents that required analysis and decision-making. This was where I knew Rebecca expected me to struggle, given her claims about my supposed poor judgment in business matters. Instead, I demonstrated not only complete understanding of my financial affairs, but also identified several opportunities for improved investment returns and risk management that impressed even the Sunset Manor staff. I walked through complex calculations in my head, explained sophisticated financial instruments with ease, and showed detailed knowledge of market conditions and economic trends that would have been impossible to fake or memorize. "Mrs. Davis, your understanding of these financial matters is quite sophisticated," observed Janet Chen, the facility's financial counselor. "You seem very much in command of your investment strategy and business operations." Rebecca's response was immediate and defensive. "That's exactly what makes this so difficult to understand. Mother can still discuss business in abstract terms, but when it comes to actual decision-making, she's been making choices that don't reflect her usual judgment. Last month, she wanted to liquidate profitable investments to fund what seemed like an irrational expansion plan." I knew exactly what Rebecca was referring to: my decision to diversify holdings by investing in renewable energy infrastructure, a move that she and David had opposed because they preferred the higher short-term returns from traditional investments. But the expansion plan she described as irrational was actually a carefully researched strategy that had already begun generating significant returns. "Could you provide more details about these concerning investment decisions?" Charles Morrison asked, his attorney instincts clearly engaged. "I'd be interested in understanding the specific choices that seemed problematic to the family." Rebecca fumbled for specifics, eventually describing investment moves that were actually quite sound. When explained in their proper context, her inability to articulate concrete examples of poor financial judgment began to undermine her credibility with the evaluation team, especially when contrasted with my demonstrated mastery of complex financial concepts. The social and behavioral assessments continued throughout the day, with staff members observing my interactions with other residents, my response to routine changes, and my ability to navigate the facility's social environment. Again, I performed exactly as one would expect from someone with normal cognitive function and good social skills. But Rebecca was prepared for this too. During the afternoon family conference, she presented a new concern that revealed the true desperation underlying her campaign. "Dr. Williams, I think there's something important you need to understand about my mother's condition," Rebecca said, leaning forward with an expression of deep worry. "She's become increasingly paranoid and suspicious, especially about family members. She's started making accusations about people trying to steal from her or manipulate her. I'm worried that her pleasant behavior here is partly an act to convince you that these concerns are unfounded. This was Rebecca's attempt to explain away any resistance I might offer to her narrative, preemptively discrediting any claims I might make about her true motivations. If I accused her of financial manipulation, she could point to this supposed paranoia as evidence of my impaired judgment. If I questioned her version of events, she could claim it was another example of the suspicious thinking that had become part of my cognitive decline. Dr. Williams looked thoughtful. Mrs. Davis, your daughter is concerned about what she describes as increased suspicion and mistrust. Have you been feeling worried about people taking advantage of you or trying to control your affairs? The question was a perfect setup for Rebecca's trap, but it was also an opportunity for me to begin revealing the truth about what had been happening. I chose my words carefully, balancing honesty with the need to appear rational and measured. Dr. Williams, I have become concerned about some recent changes in how my financial and legal affairs are being handled, I said calmly. Over the past few months, I've discovered that certain family members have been making inquiries about my estate planning and competency status without my knowledge or permission. I've also learned that some people have been discussing my supposed cognitive decline with business associates and professional contacts. I could see Rebecca's face pale slightly as I continued. I don't think it's paranoid to be concerned when someone researches guardianship procedures or schedules medical evaluations without your input. I think that's a reasonable response to discovering that people are questioning your competency behind your back. Charles Morrison had clearly been waiting for this moment. Dr. Williams, I think it might be helpful for you to understand the timeline of these events. Mrs. Davis discovered that her daughter had been consulting with attorneys about guardianship proceedings several weeks before any medical concerns were raised. She also learned that family members had been making representations about her mental state to various professional contacts. The revelation clearly surprised Dr. Williams and other staff members who had been operating under the assumption that medical concerns had prompted the legal consultations rather than the other way around. Rebecca scrambled to explain the timeline, claiming that she had sought legal advice only after being alarmed by my supposed symptoms. But Charles was prepared with documentation that told a different story. He produced records showing that Rebecca's legal consultations had begun before any of the incidents she had described as triggering her concerns. He also presented evidence of Rebecca's systematic campaign to plant seeds of doubt about my competency with various professional contacts. I think what we're seeing here is a situation where family members with potential financial interests have been working to create a narrative of incompetency rather than responding to genuine medical concerns, Charles said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that had made him such an effective attorney. Mrs. Davis has been subjected to a calculated campaign designed to undermine her reputation and justify removing her from control of her own affairs. The atmosphere in the conference room shifted dramatically as the evaluation team began to understand that they were not dealing with a straightforward case of family concern about cognitive decline. Instead, they were potentially witnessing an attempted financial exploitation disguised as medical intervention. Rebecca tried to regain control of the narrative, her voice rising with what she claimed was indignation at the accusations being made against her motives. "This is exactly what I was talking about," she said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Mother has become convinced that people are plotting against her. She's turning this medical evaluation into some kind of conspiracy theory because she can't accept that she needs help." But her emotional display was undermined by David's visible discomfort and the documented evidence that Charles continued to present. Phone records showing Rebecca's consultations with multiple attorneys, email exchanges discussing my supposed incompetency, and witness statements from people who had been approached about concerns for my mental state all painted a picture of systematic manipulation rather than spontaneous family worry. Dr. Williams called for a break in the proceedings, clearly needing time to reassess the situation in light of these new revelations. During the intermission, I could see Rebecca and David huddled in intense conversation, probably trying to figure out how their carefully planned strategy had been so thoroughly exposed. When the meeting resumed, Dr. Williams's approach had changed significantly. Instead of focusing on my supposed cognitive deficits, she began asking pointed questions about the family dynamics and the circumstances that had led to the evaluation request. "Mrs. Davis, can you help us understand your perspective on the concerns your daughter has raised?" Dr. Williams asked. "From your point of view, what has been happening in your family that led to this evaluation?" This was the moment I had been preparing for, the opportunity to present my side of the story with the credibility that comes from having documentation and evidence to support every claim. "Dr. Williams, I believe my daughter and son-in-law are facing significant financial pressures that have led them to view my estate as a solution to their problems," I said, my voice calm and measured. Rather than waiting for natural inheritance or asking for help directly, they appear to have decided that having me declared incompetent would give them immediate access to assets they need to resolve their financial difficulties. I gestured to Charles, who produced a folder containing documentation of Rebecca and David's financial situation, including loan applications that listed my estate as collateral and correspondence with creditors that referenced expected inheritance timelines. "We have evidence that Mr. and Mrs. Patterson have borrowed substantial amounts of money against the expectation of inheriting my assets," Charles explained. "These debts appear to be creating pressure for accelerated access to Mrs. Davis's estate, which would explain the urgency of their concerns about her competency." The documentation was devastating. Loan applications that David had submitted listed my net worth as security for debts that totaled nearly $2 million. Correspondence with financial institutions referenced plans for asset liquidation that could only occur if Rebecca gained control over my finances. Credit card statements showed a lifestyle that was clearly unsustainable on their actual earned income. Rebecca's attempts to deny or minimize these financial pressures only made her situation worse. Her claims that the loans were temporary arrangements and that their lifestyle was supported by David's successful career were contradicted by employment records showing his declining income and poor performance reviews. "Mrs. Patterson," Dr. Williams said, her tone now considerably cooler, "these financial documents suggest that you and your husband have substantial reasons for wanting to gain control over your mother's assets. Can you explain how these pressures might have influenced your concerns about her competency?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Rebecca's response was a mixture of denials, justifications, and attempts to redirect attention back to my supposed symptoms. But her credibility had been fundamentally undermined by the evidence of her financial motivations and her documented campaign to create a narrative of my incompetency. David tried to support Rebecca's position, but his own discomfort was obvious. He had clearly expected this evaluation to proceed smoothly, with my supposed cognitive deficits providing easy justification for the guardianship arrangements they needed to resolve their financial problems. Instead, he found himself defending against accusations of elder financial abuse in front of medical professionals who were trained to recognize exactly these types of family exploitation situations. The evaluation team requested another break to discuss their findings and determine how to proceed. During this interval, Charles pulled me aside to discuss the legal implications of what had been revealed. "Mary Ellen, this couldn't be going better from a legal standpoint," he said quietly. "Rebecca has essentially admitted to a pattern of behavior that constitutes attempted financial exploitation. The documentation we've presented makes it almost impossible for her to pursue guardianship proceedings, and it gives you strong grounds for protecting your assets from any future attempts at manipulation." But Charles also warned me that Rebecca might become more desperate and unpredictable as she realized that her plan was failing. "She's invested too much in this strategy to give up easily. We need to be prepared for her to escalate her tactics or try new approaches to gain control over your affairs." When the evaluation team reconvened, Dr. Williams's assessment was clear and unequivocal. Based on comprehensive testing, observation, and interviews, there was no evidence of cognitive impairment that would justify concerns about my competency or ability to manage my own affairs. Furthermore, the circumstances surrounding the evaluation request raised serious questions about the motivations of the family members who had initiated the process. Mrs. Davis, our assessment indicates that you demonstrate excellent cognitive function across all domains we evaluated, Dr. Williams announced. Your memory, judgment, and decision-making abilities are well within normal ranges and show no signs of impairment. Based on our findings, we see no medical justification for restrictions on your autonomy or decision-making authority. The relief I felt was enormous, but I knew that Rebecca wasn't going to accept this outcome without a fight. Her response was immediate and predictable. If the medical evaluation didn't support her claims, then there must be something wrong with the evaluation process. Dr. Williams, I appreciate your thoroughness, but I think there are aspects of my mother's condition that can't be assessed in a clinical setting, Rebecca said, her voice taking on an edge of desperation. The behaviors that concern us most happen at home, in real-world situations where the stakes are higher and the pressure is greater. But Dr. Williams had clearly reached her own conclusions about the situation. Mrs. Patterson, our evaluation process is specifically designed to assess real-world functioning and decision-making capacity. The extensive testing and observation we've conducted provides a comprehensive picture of your mother's cognitive abilities. Our findings are inconsistent with the level of impairment that would justify the concerns you've raised. Rebecca made one final attempt to salvage her position, suggesting that perhaps I needed ongoing monitoring or periodic reevaluation to catch cognitive changes that might develop in the future. But Dr. Williams firmly rejected this approach, noting that there was no medical basis for such monitoring and that it would constitute inappropriate restriction of my autonomy. The formal evaluation was concluded with a written report that thoroughly documented my cognitive competency and raised serious questions about the motivations behind the assessment request. Dr. Williams recommended that I continue with my regular physician for routine health monitoring and suggested that the family might benefit from counseling to address the apparent conflicts that had led to this situation. As we prepared to leave Sunset Manor, Rebecca made one last desperate play. She approached Dr. Williams privately, requesting a meeting to discuss additional concerns that she claimed she hadn't felt comfortable raising in front of me and my attorney. But Dr. Williams had seen enough. She politely but firmly declined the meeting, noting that the evaluation was complete and that any additional concerns should be addressed through appropriate medical channels with my own physician. She also mentioned that the facility was required to report suspected cases of elder financial abuse to appropriate authorities, a comment that sent Rebecca into a barely controlled panic. The drive back to the city was conducted in complete silence. Rebecca and David seemed to be processing the magnitude of their failure and the potential consequences of having their scheme so thoroughly exposed. I sat calmly in the back seat, finally free from the uncertainty and stress that had characterized the past several weeks. But I knew that this victory, satisfying as it was, represented only the first phase of my response to Rebecca's betrayal. She had shown her true character with stunning clarity, revealing herself to be someone willing to destroy her own mother's freedom and dignity for financial gain. The question now was what consequences she would face for this betrayal, and whether she would learn from this experience or simply try to find new ways to access what she believed was rightfully hers. That evening, alone in my penthouse for the first time in days, I reflected on everything that had transpired. The daughter I had raised with such love and devotion had attempted to have me declared incompetent and stripped of my autonomy because she needed money to pay for debts incurred maintaining a lifestyle she couldn't afford. The betrayal was so complete, so calculating, that it forced me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about Rebecca's character and values. Charles Morrison came by that evening to discuss the legal implications of what had been revealed during the evaluation process. The documentation we had gathered provided strong evidence of attempted financial exploitation, which could be used to protect my assets from any future attempts at manipulation or coercion. Mary Ellen, you need to understand that Rebecca isn't going to give up, Charles warned. She's facing financial pressures that won't disappear just because this evaluation didn't go as planned. She may try different tactics, perhaps attempting to challenge your competency through other legal channels, or finding new ways to pressure you into giving her access to your assets. Charles recommended implementing additional protective measures, including updating my estate planning documents to address the specific threats that Rebecca's behavior had revealed. He also suggested considering whether there should be consequences for beneficiaries who attempted to manipulate or exploit me, provisions that would ensure Rebecca couldn't benefit from her betrayal even if she succeeded in future attempts at financial manipulation. The irony wasn't lost on me. Rebecca's attempt to gain immediate access to my wealth had actually triggered legal protections that would make it much more difficult for her to inherit anything at all. Her greed and impatience had undermined the very thing she was trying to secure. But there was still one more revelation to come, one that would complete the picture of Rebecca's deception and provide the final piece of evidence I needed to make the most important decision of my life. The following morning would bring a phone call that would expose the full extent of her betrayal and force me to confront the painful truth about the daughter I thought I knew. The phone call came from Marcus Thompson, the private investigator I had hired to document Rebecca's activities. His voice was grim as he delivered information that would change everything. Mrs. Davis, I think you need to see what I've discovered about your daughter's recent activities. There are some recordings and documents that reveal the true scope of what she's been planning, and I think you'll find them quite disturbing. Marcus arrived at my apartment within an hour, carrying a folder of materials that would provide the final, devastating proof of Rebecca's calculated betrayal. As I reviewed the evidence he had gathered, I realized that her attempt to have me declared incompetent was only the beginning of a much larger scheme to gain complete control over my life and assets. The recordings were particularly damaging. Marcus had obtained audio of conversations between Rebecca and David, where they discussed not just having me declared incompetent, but ensuring that I remained in institutional care permanently. They had researched long-term residential facilities and discussed the advantages of keeping me isolated from business associates and family members who might question their management of my affairs. Once we get the guardianship established, we can move her to a more permanent facility, Rebecca's voice said on one recording. Some place where she'll be comfortable but where we don't have to worry about her interfering with business decisions or trying to change her estate planning. The casual way she discussed arranging my permanent imprisonment was chilling. This wasn't a daughter concerned about her mother's welfare. This was someone planning to warehouse an inconvenient obstacle to her financial goals. Even more disturbing were the discussions about asset liquidation and business restructuring that would begin immediately after they gained control. Rebecca and David had detailed plans for selling off parts of my business empire, liquidating investments, and redirecting funds to pay their debts and finance their lifestyle. They had no interest in preserving the company I had spent decades building or maintaining the charitable commitments that had been important to me throughout my career. The old lady's been way too conservative with the investments, David's voice said on another recording. Once we're in control, we can leverage the assets much more aggressively and generate the kind of returns we need to handle our obligations. The old lady. That's how my son-in-law referred to me in private conversations with my daughter. Not as a family member deserving respect and care, but as an obstacle to be removed so they could access what they viewed as their rightful inheritance. The documents Marcus had obtained were equally revealing. Rebecca had been in contact with real estate agents about selling my penthouse, with financial advisors about restructuring my investment portfolio, and with business brokers about potential buyers for various components of my company. She had been planning not just to control my assets, but to dismantle everything I had built and convert it to cash that could address their immediate financial needs. Most shocking of all was evidence. That Rebecca had been researching the effects of various medications on elderly patients with cognitive impairment. She had downloaded information about drugs that could cause confusion, memory problems, and behavioral changes, and had been in contact with sources about obtaining substances that weren't part of standard medical treatment. "Marcus, are you suggesting that Rebecca was planning to drug me?" I asked, hardly believing that even she could contemplate such a thing. "The evidence suggests that she was at least researching the possibility," Marcus replied grimly. "If the competency evaluation didn't go as planned, she may have been considering ways to artificially create the symptoms of cognitive decline that would justify her concerns." The scope of Rebecca's deception and planning was breathtaking, in its callousness and thoroughness. She hadn't just been trying to steal my money. She had been planning to destroy my life completely, turning me into a medicated prisoner while she dismantled everything I had worked to build. Armed with this devastating evidence of Rebecca's true intentions, I knew that the time had come to implement the final phase of my own plan. She had shown herself to be capable of betrayal beyond anything I could have imagined, and she needed to understand that actions have consequences, especially when they involve attempting to destroy. Someone who has spent decades learning how to protect herself from exactly these kinds of attacks. The legal documents I had prepared with Elizabeth Harper were now ready to be activated. Rebecca's attempt to gain control over my assets would instead result in her losing any claim to those assets permanently. The estate planning revisions I had made would ensure that someone willing to betray her own mother for money would not benefit from that betrayal, regardless of whether her schemes succeeded or failed. But there was one more step to take, one final confrontation that would bring this nightmare to its conclusion and ensure that Rebecca understood the full consequences of her choices. Tomorrow, I would call her for a meeting that would determine not just the fate of my fortune, but the final truth about our relationship and what it had really meant to both of us. The meeting I arranged with Rebecca took place in the same mahogany conference room where this story began, though she had no idea what awaited her there. I had Charles Morrison schedule it as a routine estate planning discussion, the kind of meeting that Rebecca had been pushing for months. She arrived with David and her attorney, all of them carrying the confident air of people who believed they were finally going to secure the control over my assets that had eluded them during the failed competency evaluation. Rebecca walked into that room believing she was about to inherit $300 million. She was dressed in an expensive black suit that she probably thought appropriate for taking charge of family business affairs, her hair styled perfectly, her makeup flawless. She looked every inch the successful businesswoman ready to assume control of a corporate empire. What she didn't know was that over the past 72 hours, I had been systematically dismantling every assumption she had made about her future and mine. "Mother, I'm so glad you're ready to discuss estate planning in a serious way," Rebecca said, as she settled into her chair, her voice carrying that familiar tone of patient condescension. "After everything that's happened, I think we can all agree that it's time to put proper arrangements in place." I smiled at her, the same warm smile I had given her throughout her childhood when she had accomplished something that made me proud. "Oh, Rebecca, I couldn't agree more. It's definitely time to put proper arrangements in place." Charles Morrison opened his briefcase and removed a thick stack of documents, placing them carefully on the polished table. Rebecca's attorney leaned forward, clearly eager to review whatever estate planning revisions I had prepared. David pulled out his phone, probably ready to calculate how quickly they could begin liquidating assets to address their financial obligations. "Before we begin," I said calmly, "I think there are some things you should understand about recent developments in my estate planning. Charles, would you please explain the new provisions?" Charles cleared his throat and began reading from the document that would change Rebecca's life forever. "Mrs. Davis has executed a comprehensive revision of her estate planning documents, effective immediately. The new provisions include specific clauses addressing attempted financial exploitation by beneficiaries." Rebecca's confident expression flickered slightly, but she maintained her composure. "That sounds very prudent, Mother. I'm sure we all want to protect the family assets from any potential problems." "I'm particularly proud of Section 12, I continued, my voice remaining steady and pleasant. "Charles, could you read that section aloud?" Charles found the relevant page and began reading in his clear, authoritative voice. Section 12, Disinheritance Provisions. In the event that any beneficiary attempts to challenge the competency of the grantor, seeks to obtain guardianship or conservatorship through legal proceedings, or engages in any form of financial manipulation or exploitation, said beneficiary shall forfeit all claims to inheritance and shall be permanently removed from all estate planning documents. The color began draining from Rebecca's face as the implications of these words sank in. David's phone slipped from his hands, clattering onto the table. Their attorney started to speak, then stopped, realizing that he was witnessing something far more complex than a routine estate planning meeting. "Furthermore," Charles continued, "the grantor has documented evidence of attempted financial exploitation, including recordings of conversations discussing plans for permanent institutionalization, asset liquidation, and the artificial creation of cognitive symptoms through unauthorized medication." Rebecca's mask of composure finally cracked completely. "Mother, what are you talking about? This is insane. We were only trying to help you, to make sure you were getting the care you needed." I reached into my own briefcase and withdrew a small digital recorder, placing it gently on the table between us. "Would you like to hear yourself discussing how to keep the old lady permanently institutionalized while you liquidate her assets? Or perhaps you'd prefer to listen to David explaining how much more aggressively you plan to leverage my investments once I'm out of the way?" The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca stared at the recorder as if it were a poisonous snake, her mouth opening and closing without any sound emerging. David had gone completely pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the conference room. "Rebecca," I said softly, my voice carrying all the disappointment and heartbreak I had been holding inside for months. "I raised you to understand that actions have consequences. I taught you that loyalty and love are precious gifts that should never be taken for granted. I believed that the values I instilled in you would guide you through life's challenges with integrity and honor." I stood up from my chair, moving around the table until I was directly in front of her. "Instead, you chose to betray those values and that trust in the most fundamental way possible. You decided that my money was more important than my life, my freedom, or the relationship we had built together over 34 years. Rebecca finally found her voice, but it came out as a desperate whisper. "Mother, please. You don't understand the pressure we've been under, the debts, the obligations. We just needed some help, some access to resources that would eventually be ours anyway." "Help?" I repeated, my voice rising slightly. "Rebecca, you researched how to drug me into cognitive decline. You planned to have me declared incompetent and warehoused in an institution while you destroyed everything I built. That wasn't asking for help. That was attempted murder of everything I am and everything I've worked for." The truth hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire that had consumed our entire relationship. Rebecca tried one more desperate gambit, appealing to emotions and memories that she had already poisoned beyond repair. "Mother, I'm your daughter. I'm your only child. Surely we can work through this, find some way to repair what's been damaged. Family is supposed to forgive, supposed to stand by each other no matter what." I looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the accomplished woman she appeared to be, but the calculating stranger she had revealed herself to be. "Rebecca, you stopped being my daughter the moment you decided that inheriting my money was more important than honoring my life. Family doesn't try to destroy each other for financial gain. Love doesn't research guardianship procedures and institutional care options. The woman sitting in front of me is someone I no longer recognize." Charles Morrison had prepared additional documents that formalized the consequences of Rebecca's choices. The disinheritance was complete and irrevocable, with legal protections that would prevent any future challenges or attempts to restore her inheritance rights. The $300 million she had been counting on would instead go to charitable foundations and institutions that would honor the values she had rejected. But the financial consequences were only part of the price Rebecca would pay for her betrayal. I had also compiled comprehensive documentation of her attempted financial exploitation and submitted it to appropriate authorities. Elder abuse, even attempted elder abuse, carried serious legal penalties that could include criminal charges and civil liability. Rebecca, in addition to losing your inheritance, you and David will be facing investigation by the district attorney's office for attempted financial exploitation of an elderly person, I announced, watching her face crumble as she realized the full scope of the consequences she was facing. The recordings, documents, and witness testimony provide substantial evidence of criminal intent. David finally found his voice, stammering excuses and denials that sounded pathetic even to his own ears. Mrs. Davis, there's been a misunderstanding. We never intended any harm. We were genuinely concerned about your welfare. David, I said, turning to face him directly, I have recordings of you discussing how to leverage my assets much more aggressively once you gained control. I have documentation of your research into permanent institutional care options and discussions about keeping me isolated from people who might question your decisions. Those aren't the words or actions of someone concerned about my welfare. The meeting concluded with Rebecca and David's attorney advising them to seek separate legal counsel for the criminal investigation that would be forthcoming. Rebecca made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of her scheme, begging for another chance, promising to change, swearing that she had learned from her mistakes. But some betrayals are too complete to forgive, and some trust, once shattered, can never be rebuilt. The daughter who had been willing to destroy my life for money had revealed herself to be someone I could never trust again, someone whose presence in my life would always be a threat to my security and peace of mind. Rebecca, I said as she prepared to leave the conference room, I want you to understand something very clearly. The woman who raised you, who loved you unconditionally, who sacrificed everything to give you opportunities and advantages, that woman is gone. You killed her when you decided that money was more important than family. What you're left with is a stranger who knows exactly who you are and will never again make the mistake of trusting you. After they left, I remained in the conference room for a few more minutes, processing the finality of what had just occurred. The relationship that had been the center of my life for over 3 decades was over, destroyed not by time or distance or natural growing apart, but by greed and betrayal that had revealed character flaws I had been blind to for far too long. Charles Morrison reviewed the legal protections we had put in place, ensuring that Rebecca would never again be able to threaten my autonomy or security. The estate planning revisions were comprehensive and ironclad, designed to prevent any future attempts at manipulation or exploitation. The charitable foundations that would receive my assets were established institutions with proven track records of responsible stewardship and meaningful impact. In the weeks that followed, Rebecca and David faced the consequences of their choices, with a swiftness that probably surprised them. The criminal investigation proceeded rapidly, aided by the comprehensive documentation I had provided. Their financial situation, already precarious, collapsed completely under the weight of legal fees and the loss of expected inheritance that had been securing their debts. The business community, always quick to recognize and distance itself from scandal, quietly ostracized them both. David's investment banking career effectively ended when his firm learned about the elder abuse investigation. Rebecca found herself unemployable in the corporate world she had worked so hard to conquer, her reputation permanently tainted by her betrayal of the mother who had given her every advantage. But for me, the end of this nightmare was not about revenge or punishment. It was about freedom and peace. For the first time in months, I could sleep soundly, knowing that no one was plotting to strip away my autonomy or destroy everything I had built. I could make decisions without wondering whether they would be used as evidence of incompetency. I could trust that the people around me valued my well-being rather than viewing me as an obstacle to their financial goals. The penthouse that had felt so lonely during the worst days of Rebecca's campaign now felt like a sanctuary again. I filled my days with work that mattered, charitable activities that made a difference, and relationships with people who respected and valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide for them. 6 months later, I received a letter from Rebecca, probably written at the suggestion of her attorney as she faced the reality of criminal charges and financial ruin. The letter was full of apologies and explanations, claims that she had been driven by desperation and pressure, promises that she had learned from her mistakes and would never again betray my trust. I read the letter once, then placed it in my fireplace and watched it burn. Some wounds are too deep to heal, and some betrayals reveal truths about character that can never be unknown. The daughter I had loved was gone, replaced by a stranger, whose desperation had led her to attempt the destruction of everything I was and everything I had worked to become. But I was still Mary Ellen Davis, and I had survived the worst betrayal imaginable while protecting everything I valued most. The empire I had built would continue under my guidance. The charitable causes I supported would flourish with proper stewardship, and the values I had tried to instill in Rebecca would live on through the institutions and people who truly understood their importance. Standing in my penthouse that evening, looking out at the city lights that had witnessed my rise from nothing to everything, I felt not sadness for what I had lost, but gratitude for what I had preserved. Rebecca's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also revealed my own strength and resilience. I had faced the ultimate test of character and emerged not just intact, but stronger than ever. The $300 million that Rebecca had tried to steal would indeed change lives, just not in the way she had planned. It would fund scholarships for young women starting businesses, support research into protecting elderly people from financial exploitation, and ensure that other families would never have to endure what I had experienced. And somewhere in that transformation of intended theft into meaningful charity, I found the peace that had eluded me during the darkest days of my daughter's betrayal. Rebecca had tried to destroy me, but instead, she had given me the opportunity to create something lasting and valuable from the ashes of our broken relationship. That, I realized, was perhaps the most fitting consequence of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.